The truth doesn't always arrive like thunder. It sometimes arrives as a whisper that ruins everything. I remember the exact moment my world split in half, standing barefoot in my apartment kitchen in Chicago, holding a thin envelope that changed the way I breathed. Two pink lines had already rewritten my future, but I was still trying to convince myself that love would make it simpler. That Domenico Romano, Nick to the world, a man who moved through life like silence obeyed him, would somehow choose me over everything else he was born into. Then I saw the headline on my phone. Engaged. Not to me. Not even close. To someone whose name carried weight in places I was never meant to enter. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there staring at the screen until the edges of it blurred, until the air in my lungs felt too heavy to hold. Nick had always told me there were parts of his life I didn't need to understand, that love didn't require full visibility. But in that moment, I understood something far more painful. I had never been part of those hidden parts at all. I was just a pause in a story already written. My hands moved before my thoughts could catch up. The ultrasound photo, my only proof of something so fragile it barely felt real, was in my drawer. I lit the stove without thinking, watching the paper curl at the edges, turning dark, disappearing into something I couldn't take back. I told myself it was anger, but it was really fear dressed as control. If I erased the proof, maybe I could erase the truth that I had been left behind. Maybe I could stop myself from needing anything from him at all. When the fire died, so did something inside me that I didn't have a name for yet. I packed a small bag, nothing more than what I could carry in one hand, and left before sunrise painted the city in gold. No note, no explanation, just the quiet disappearance of someone who knew she would never be chosen. I thought distance would make it easier, that leaving would turn pain into memory. But I didn't understand how men like Domenico Romano existed in the world I was stepping away from. I didn't understand that silence, for him, was never acceptance, it was observation. And somewhere across the city, in a building made of glass and authority, he was already beginning to notice that something essential had gone missing from his life. Not because I mattered to his world, but because I had stopped existing inside it without permission. And that was the first mistake I made. The city did not care that I was gone. Chicago kept moving the same way it always did, slow and indifferent, like nothing inside it ever truly belonged to anyone. I learned that on my second night in a small rented studio on the west side, where the walls were too thin and the silence inside them was even thinner. I kept my phone off most of the time, not because I was waiting for a call, but because I was afraid of what I might hear if I gave the world permission to reach me again. I told myself I was rebuilding, but really I was just surviving minutes that refused to turn into hours. I avoided mirrors. I avoided anything that looked like certainty. And I avoided his name, even though it followed me in ways I could not explain. Domenico Romano did not exist in my world anymore. At least that is what I tried to believe. Then, on a Thursday morning at exactly 7:42, everything shifted without warning. I was standing in line at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment, holding a paper cup that was too hot, listening to strangers talk about weather forecasts and traffic reports, when the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that my body noticed before my mind understood. The barista stopped mid-sentence. A man behind me went silent. Even the soft background music seemed to lose its rhythm. I did not need to turn around to know. Some presences do not announce themselves. They arrive like gravity. When I finally looked over my shoulder, I saw him across the street, standing still as if the entire block had arranged itself around him. He was not supposed to be there. Not in this part of the city. Not in my life at all. But there he was, dressed in a dark coat that made everything around him look temporary, his gaze fixed on the coffee shop window like he already knew I was inside. My fingers tightened around the cup so hard I felt the heat through the cardboard. I stepped back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go that did not feel like a decision I was not ready to make. And then he moved. Not quickly, not urgently, just with certainty. Across the street, through the morning traffic, past people who seemed to instinctively step aside without understanding why. I told myself to leave. I told myself to disappear through the back exit, to continue the version of my life that did not involve him. But my body did not listen. It remembered things my mind had tried to erase. When he reached the entrance, he did not speak immediately. He just looked at me the way someone looks at something they believed was lost. There was no anger in his expression. No relief either. Only recognition. the kind that makes silence heavier than words. I should have said something first. I should have demanded answers, or at least distance. Instead, I felt my voice break before it even formed. And when he finally spoke, it was not a question. It was not an explanation. It was something far more absolute, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the sound of my own pulse. You disappeared from a world that does not allow disappearances, he said, and I understood then that whatever I thought I had escaped was never something I could outrun. Because men like Domenico Romano do not search for what they have lost the way ordinary people do. They follow the absence until it becomes impossible to ignore. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a coffee shop that suddenly felt too small for the air between us, I realized I had not left his world at all. I had only made myself visible to it in a different way. For a moment, I convinced myself that if I did not move, if I did not acknowledge what stood in front of me, then the world might correct itself and pretend none of this was real. But silence has never been something Domenico Romano accepted from anyone, least of all from me. He stood just inside the coffee shop entrance, not stepping further in, not forcing the space between us, and yet somehow taking control of it anyway. His eyes did not leave mine, and I felt the weight of that. A tension like a pressure in the air that made it difficult to breathe normally. People around us continued their morning routines, ordering drinks, checking phones, adjusting coats, but none of them seemed aware that something invisible had shifted in the center of the room. I should have told him to leave. I should have walked away. Instead, I held onto the edge of the counter as if it could anchor me to a version of myself that was still untouched by him. You are not difficult to find when I understand what I am looking for, he said finally, his voice calm in a way that did not invite argument. There was no threat in his tone, no need for it. His certainty carried its own weight. I forced myself to speak, though my voice did not sound like it belonged to me. I did not want to be found. The words should have been enough. They were not. Something in his expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, like he had expected resistance and was measuring its shape rather than reacting to it. He took one step closer, and I noticed how carefully he moved, as if every action had consequences already calculated. You left without a conversation, he said. That is not the same as leaving. My grip on the cup loosened slightly, enough that I had to set it down before I dropped it. The warmth of it remained on my fingers like a reminder that I was still physically present, still here, still part of a moment I did not know how to exit. I thought of the apartment I had left behind, the small bag I had carried, the nights I had spent convincing myself that distance would turn emotion into something manageable. None of it felt real anymore. You are engaged, I said quietly, forcing the words out as if they were facts that could protect me. For the first time, something shifted in his expression that was not calculated. It was subtle, but it was there. Not surprise, not denial. Something closer to frustration, as if the truth I had accepted had been incomplete. That arrangement is not what you think it is, he said. I almost laughed, but it came out as nothing more than a breath. It is enough for me to understand where I stand. He studied me for a long moment, and I had the strange sense that he was not looking at the situation as I understood it, but at something beneath it, something I did not have access to. When he spoke again, his voice lowered slightly. Where you stand is not something you decide in isolation. The words unsettled me more than they should have, not because of their meaning, but because of the assumption behind them, as if my choices had always been part of something larger than my awareness. I stepped back, finally creating distance between us, though it felt artificial, like moving a chair in a room where the structure itself had already changed. I am not part of your world, I said, though I no longer sounded convinced of it. For a moment, he did not respond. He simply looked at me with an intensity that made it feel like time had slowed around the edges of everything else. Then, quietly, he said, "You were never outside it to begin with." And in that instant, I understood that the mistake I had made was not leaving. It was believing that leaving had ever been mine to define. The silence between us did not break after his last words. It only changed shape, becoming heavier, more deliberate, like something neither of us could step out of once it had settled into place. I stood there in the coffee shop doorway, aware of every small sound around us, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft clink of ceramic cups, the distant hum of traffic outside, yet none of it reached me in a way that felt real. Domenico Romano remained where he was, not closing the distance again, not pushing further, but he no longer needed to. Whatever boundary I believed existed had already been crossed in ways I did not yet fully understand. I finally forced myself to move, stepping to the side as if I could physically reposition myself out of the gravity he created. "You cannot decide what my life was before you," I said quietly, though the words lacked the certainty I wanted them to have. He watched me carefully, as if I had revealed something worth studying rather than arguing against. "I am not deciding your past," he replied. "I am recognizing its connections." That sentence stayed with me, longer than I expected, because it did not sound like persuasion. It sounded like confirmation of something already in motion. I turned away from him slightly, looking out through the glass window at the street beyond. Cars passed. People walked. Everything outside continued without pause, as if nothing inside this small space mattered enough to interrupt it. I wished I could step into that ordinary movement and disappear inside it. Instead, I felt his presence behind me without needing to look. "If you truly wanted distance," he said, "you would not have stayed in a city where distance is impossible." I did not answer immediately, not because I had a response, but because I did not. I had chosen Chicago without thinking about what it meant to choose it. I had believed leaving one place was enough to create separation from everything tied to him. Now that belief felt fragile, like something I had constructed too quickly without understanding its structure. When I finally spoke, my voice was quieter. "I did not know you would look for me." A pause followed, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. "That is where you misunderstand," he said. "I was not looking for you until you stopped existing in the place I expected you to be." The phrasing unsettled me more than anything else he had said, because it reframed my disappearance not as escape, but as disruption, as if I had altered something I was never aware I was part of. I turned back to face him fully now, needing to see his expression clearly. There was no anger in it, no frustration, only focus, steady and unbroken, as if whatever emotion this was had already passed through reaction and settled into intention. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I was no longer sure the question made sense. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied me in a way that felt less like observation and more like acknowledgement of something already decided. "I want you to stop believing you were ever outside of what happened," he said finally. The words did not comfort me. They did not threaten me either. They simply existed, reshaping the way I understood every decision I had made in the last several days. And for the first time since I had left, I began to wonder if running had ever been the same thing as leaving. The air between us felt different after his last words, as if something invisible had shifted into place that neither silence nor distance could undo. I could still hear the faint rhythm of the coffee shop around us, but it no longer anchored me in anything familiar. Domenico Romano stood exactly where he had been, calm in a way that made it impossible to tell whether time affected him at all. I tried to focus on something ordinary, the sound of a cup being placed on a counter, the soft murmur of a conversation nearby, anything that reminded me I was still inside a public place where I was supposed to feel safe. But safety was no longer something my body recognized. "You keep speaking as if I belong to something I cannot see," I said quietly, more to steady myself than to challenge him. His gaze did not waver. "You are not meant to see it yet," he replied, as if that alone explained everything. I felt a sharp frustration rise inside me, not loud but persistent, the kind that comes from being spoken to like your understanding of your own life is incomplete. "Then explain it," I said, though I was not sure I wanted the answer. For a moment, he did not respond, and in that pause I noticed something I had missed before. He was not simply watching me. He was measuring the space I occupied in relation to everything else around me, as if I were not separate from a larger structure, but already embedded within it. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steady. "The engagement you referenced is not what defines the situation you are reacting to." I hesitated, unsure whether I was hearing clarification or evasion. "Then what does?" I asked. He took a small step closer, not enough to invade the space completely, but enough that the distance between us stopped feeling neutral. "What defines it," he said, "is that you made a decision based on incomplete truth." The words landed differently than I expected, not as accusation, but as certainty. I looked away for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to find a version of logic that could hold everything together. "I made a decision to leave," I said finally. That was not incomplete. A quiet pause followed, and for the first time, something in his expression softened in a way that was not emotional but attentive. Leaving without understanding context is not departure, he said. It is interruption. I felt something tighten in my chest at the word, because it suggested continuity where I had believed there was none. Before I could respond, he added something that changed the shape of the conversation entirely. An interruption is always noticed. I stood there, realizing that every assumption I had built about distance, about absence, about control, was being quietly dismantled without force, only awareness. Outside the window, a car passed slowly, headlights reflecting briefly across the glass before disappearing down the street. I wondered how long he had known I was gone before he decided to find me, and more importantly, what it meant that he had not needed to search in the way I had imagined. So what happens now? I asked, though the question felt less like curiosity and more like surrender to inevitability. Domenico looked at me for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was no urgency in his answer. Now, he said, you stopped believing you were ever outside the reach of consequences that were never finished with you. And for the first time since this began, I understood that my disappearance had not ended anything at all. It had only delayed the moment I would have to face what had been waiting quietly for me all along. The words he left hanging in the air did not fade when I stopped speaking. They settled instead, quietly, like something that had always been waiting for permission to exist. I became aware of how still I was standing, how unchanged the world around us looked despite the way everything inside me had begun to shift. Domenico Romano did not move to fill the silence. He let it stretch, as if silence itself was part of the answer he wanted me to understand. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to look away from him toward the window again, toward the steady flow of people outside who had no idea that anything in my life had just been rewritten for the second time in less than a week. If what you are saying is true, I said carefully, then you are telling me I never had control to begin with. He did not deny it immediately, and that hesitation was more unsettling than a refusal would have been. Control is not the same as awareness, he finally said. You had choices. You simply did not see all of them. I felt my fingers curl into my palm without realizing it, grounding myself in something physical as my mind tried to process what he was implying. The idea that my decisions had been made within boundaries I did not recognize was not comforting. It was destabilizing. And now, I asked quietly, what changes now that I know you are here? His gaze remained steady, not softening, not hardening, simply present in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Now you stop making decisions based on incomplete understanding, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight in the way he delivered them, as if they were not suggestions but inevitable steps in a process already in motion. I looked down for a moment, my thoughts tangled in everything I had tried to leave behind. The city outside felt suddenly distant, like something I was no longer fully part of. When I looked back up, I noticed a black vehicle across the street, stationary in a way that felt deliberate. I had not seen it arrive. I could not tell how long it had been there. Something about it made the space around it feel structured, as if its presence had been placed rather than parked. My attention returned to Domenico, and I realized he had already noticed my reaction. You do not need to be afraid of what is outside, he said quietly. Nothing outside this moment is new to me. That statement should have alarmed me more than it did, but instead it created a strange clarity. He was not reacting to chaos. He was managing something already defined. Then why find me now? I asked, my voice lower than before. He regarded me for a long moment, and when he answered, there was something precise in his tone, something that suggested this decision had not been made lightly or recently. Because continuing to ignore what you represent would have created consequences I chose not to allow. The phrasing made my stomach tighten, not because it was threatening, but because it implied structure, responsibility, and something I was not yet able to name. I took a slow step back, though there was nowhere meaningful to retreat to. I am not something to be managed, I said, though the words lacked conviction. His expression did not change, but his voice lowered slightly, enough that it felt like it belonged only to me. Not managed, he said. Protected. And in that single word, I realized the difference between what I thought I had escaped and what I was now standing inside of, because protection from someone like him did not exist without belonging to the system that required it. The word he left in the air stayed with me longer than anything else he had said that morning. Protected. It was simple, almost gentle on the surface, but the way Domenico Romano spoke it made it feel less like reassurance and more like definition. I stood there, still near the coffee shop window, aware that my body had stopped responding the way I expected it to. Every instinct I had once trusted now felt slightly out of sync with the reality unfolding in front of me. "I do not need protection," I said, though the sentence sounded more like something I wished were true than something I actually believed. He did not react immediately. Instead, he glanced once toward the street, toward the black vehicle that had remained across from us, and then back to me, as if confirming something without needing to explain it. "That is not a decision you make in isolation," he said calmly. I felt a slow frustration rise in my chest, not sharp, but persistent. It was not the content of his words that unsettled me most, but the certainty behind them, the way he spoke as if my understanding of my own life had always been secondary to something larger. "You keep saying things like I am part of something I do not understand," I said, "but you are not explaining anything." For the first time since he had arrived, something subtle changed in his expression. Not emotion exactly, but attention shifting inward, as if he was deciding how much truth I was allowed to hear. "Explanation requires a foundation," he said. "You are still standing on assumptions that are not accurate." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers lightly against the edge of the counter beside me, grounding myself in something physical. The idea that I had been operating on incomplete assumptions was not new to me, but hearing it framed so deliberately by him made it feel heavier, more structured. "Then give me something that is accurate," I said quietly. A pause followed, not empty, but measured. When he finally spoke again, his voice lowered slightly. "You are connected to circumstances that did not begin with you," he said, "and they will not end simply because you attempt to remove yourself from them." I felt my throat tighten slightly at that, because it mirrored something I had been avoiding thinking about since the moment I left my apartment. The belief that absence could undo consequence was starting to feel less like hope and more like denial. I looked past him again, out into the street, where movement continued without awareness of anything happening inside this small space. People passed. Cars moved. Life did not pause for internal collapse. When I looked back, Domenico had not moved closer, but the distance between us felt different now, as if it had lost its meaning entirely. "If what you are saying is true," I said slowly, "then I never had a version of safety that was independent from you." He did not confirm it directly, but he did not deny it either. Instead, he said something that settled into the space between us with quiet precision. "Safety is never independent," he said. "It is structured." I stared at him for a moment, trying to find the point where his words became something I could challenge instead of absorb. But the more I tried to separate them, the more they seemed to align into something coherent, something I had not been able to see before because I had not known where to look. "And what happens if I reject that structure?" I asked finally. His gaze remained steady. "Then you discover what exists outside of it," he said, "and I am not certain you would prefer that outcome." The answer should have felt like pressure. Instead, it felt like information I was not yet equipped to fully interpret. And for the first time since he had found me again, I realized the most unsettling part was not that he had followed me. It was that nothing in his presence suggested I had ever truly left him to begin with. The silence after his last words did not feel like an ending. It felt like a pause before something irreversible continued. I stood there, still facing Domenico Romano, aware that my ability to categorize what was happening to me was slowly dissolving. Nothing about this conversation resembled anything I had experienced before, and yet every sentence he spoke carried the weight of certainty, as if I were the only variable he had not yet accounted for. Outside the coffee shop window, the street remained unchanged, but I no longer trusted what unchanged meant. I exhaled slowly, forcing my thoughts into something resembling order. "If I step away from this," I said carefully, "if I remove myself completely, what happens then?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me for a brief moment, not distracted, but calculating, as if the question itself required more than language to resolve. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. "Then you lose access to the conditions that have already been established around you." I frowned slightly, trying to translate the meaning into something concrete. "Conditions," I repeated. "What conditions?" A faint shift passed through his expression, subtle enough that most people would miss it. Not hesitation, but recognition that I was still trying to interpret the world without acknowledging its structure. The kind you do not notice until they are absent, he said. The words lingered uncomfortably, not because they were dramatic, but because they were vague enough to suggest scale without revealing boundaries. I felt my grip on reality loosen slightly, not in panic, but in confusion, as if I were missing a foundational explanation everyone else had been given except me. I am trying to understand why my leaving matters to you at all, I said. If I am truly not part of your life, then why is this even happening? For the first time, his gaze softened slightly, not emotionally, but in focus, as if he was no longer observing a situation, but confirming its center. You are asking the wrong question, he said. I felt a quiet frustration rise again, but it was no longer sharp. It was exhausted. Then tell me the right one, I replied. He took a small step to the side, not closer, not further, just repositioning within the space as if the conversation itself required alignment. The correct question, he said, is not why it matters to me. It is why you believe it ever stopped mattering to anything beyond you. The sentence did not land immediately. It hovered, unfinished in my understanding, until the implications began to settle one by one. I looked down at my hands for a moment, realizing they were no longer shaking, but also no longer certain. The idea that my departure had not created separation, but simply altered visibility, made the world feel less like something I had stepped out of and more like something I had misread from the beginning. I looked back up at him slowly. So what now? I asked quietly, not as resistance, but as uncertainty. Domenico Romano met my gaze without hesitation. Now, he said, you begin to understand what you were already inside of before you chose to look away. And in that moment, I understood that the distance I thought I had created was never measured in space at all, but in awareness I had not yet reached. The words he left me with did not disappear when the conversation stopped. They followed me out of the coffee shop like something I could not physically see but could no longer ignore. I remember standing on the sidewalk, the cold air of Chicago brushing against my skin, realizing that the city had not changed at all in the hours since I first met him there, but something inside me had. Domenico Romano stood a few steps away, not blocking my path, not forcing me to stay, but also not giving the illusion that I was free in the way I used to define freedom. There was a car waiting across the street again, dark, still, patient, as if it had been there long before I arrived, and would remain long after I made my next decision. I finally spoke without turning to look at him. If everything you are saying is true, I said slowly, then what exactly am I supposed to do now? There was a brief silence before he answered, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing precision over simplicity. You stop assuming that distance changes structure, he said. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my thoughts, but it did not help. The idea that my choices had never existed in isolation was beginning to reshape every decision I thought I had made in the last few days. I turned slightly toward him again. I burned every connection I had to you, I said. I left without telling anyone. I made sure there was nothing left. His expression did not change, but his voice lowered slightly when he responded. You removed visibility, he said. Not connection. The distinction made my chest tighten, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise in a way I could not easily dismiss. I looked down at the pavement, watching people pass between us without knowing that anything significant was happening at all. Then tell me what I am inside of, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, not closing the distance completely, but enough that I had to acknowledge his presence without ignoring it. You are inside a sequence of decisions that did not begin with your awareness, he said finally, and they do not end simply because you choose to step away from them. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not because I understood everything, but because I was beginning to understand that understanding might not be immediate. For the first time, I stopped trying to translate his words into something familiar. Instead, I listened to them as they were. I thought about the apartment I had left, the silence I had tried to create, the belief that absence could rewrite consequence. None of it felt wrong anymore, but it also did not feel complete. So I am not outside this, I said quietly. He met my gaze directly. You never were, he replied. And in that moment, standing between the motion of a city that did not stop and a man who did not need to move to feel present, I understood that what I had thought was escape was only the first time I had been fully seen.